It's Wednesday, July 29th, 2015, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we'll be joined by one of our mentors, Jonathan Berg, Director of Product Management over at Schoology. And he's going to be leading a talk on selling the project, connecting to value. So let me briefly, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, explain the format today. The people you see along the bottom of your screen here are mentors and mentees within Session 3 of the Product Mentor Program. Product Mentor Program is one of those very difficult to get into programs, but great when you get into it. Helps product managers take their careers to that next level, whether it is getting that next promotion or just really refining those product management skills. And so what you see along the bottom of your screen are people who are in the session, or some of the people who are in Session 3 of the Product Mentor Program right now. Our next program, Session 4, is going to be starting November 1st. Always looking for more mentors, so definitely if you're interested in being a mentor, definitely sign up at theproductmentor.com. And so let's just quickly go around before I tell you, and then I'll tell you a little bit more. Let's go around the room with just some quick introductions, say who you are, and whether or not you're a mentor or mentee in the program. And let's start with Vikas first.
Hi, my name is Vikas Batra. I'm a product management leader at Alcatel-Lucent, and I'm a mentor.
Excellent. And we'll go to Ladislav.
Hi everyone, I'm Ladislav. I'm an e-commerce product manager in London, working at a broadcasting company, and currently I'm the mentor of the mentors. Thanks.
And Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm a mentor. I'm a director of product management at Schoology. I'm currently a mentor in Session 3 of the Product Mentor.
Excellent. Anthony.
Hey guys, I'm Anthony Nguyen. I'm one of the mentees, and I'm a product manager at Vitals, a tech company specializing in healthcare transparency, and I'm based in New York.
Excellent. And so for those of you who are joining us, if you go to theproductmentor.com/live, you'll be able to get to see the video and also be able to ask your questions. And as the questions come in, I'll be moderating and passing them along to Jonathan in as close to real time as I possibly can. And a little bit about myself, I am Jeremy Horn, also known as the Product Guy, and I'll be moderating. And with all that said, let me hand it over to you, Jonathan, to begin today's talk on selling the project and connecting to value.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me switch into the presentation here. Okay, so you should be able to see that now. All right, so the topic of this presentation is selling the project. And I'll just lead off by saying that we're all, as product managers, we're all in sales, and it reminds me of a story back in actually my very first job. During the orientation week, they told us, they made us all stand up and say, "Guess what, everyone? You're all in sales," and we all had to repeat that we were all in sales. And at the time, I think it was as much about conveying the fact that interacting with customers, we were representatives of the company. But since then, I've really come to realize that as a product manager, sales is an integral part. Selling your project internally, externally, is an integral part of what we do. I'll come back to that later on. So the inspiration for this talk actually came from a product group session several months ago. And at the time, a person in the room asked a question. And she had a product that she was managing, and she was convinced that there was some important enhancements to make for users, but she was having trouble convincing her leadership. And specifically, I don't remember the name of the company, but it was either an HR or healthcare management app. And the challenge that she had was that she worked for a company that was building this platform. The company had its customers, who were typically other companies, and the users who were going to benefit from her changes weren't necessarily making the decisions. So, so she was trying to figure out, how to convince that, how to convince her leaders of that. And so we had an interesting conversation at the product group, and that got me thinking, and that's where the idea for this came from. So, just a little bit about me. I am a director of product management at Schoology. Schoology is a education software company. I've been building products for nearly 19 years, or for 19 years, nearly 20 years now. I started off in engineering, but I've been a product manager for 10 years. My experience in product management actually is pretty broad. I've worked in some really large companies, 60, 70,000 strong, Fortune 500 type companies. And specifically, I spent 8 years at American Express in the financial services industry. I've also worked at some pretty small companies. Schoology is in the 150 to 200 range. I also worked at a couple of startups that were less than 20. And all the stuff that I'm talking about today, one of the things I want to stress is these really apply whether you're working at large companies and small companies. Regardless, you'll find that you can adapt these and they're always relevant. I've also had I've been lucky enough to travel to a few different countries and work in a few different countries. So I've seen some different working styles, and that's been interesting as well. And the companies that I've been in have spanned different industries. So I mentioned financial services and education. Some of the startups that I was in were also apps, B2B, and B2C. So I've seen a variety of different products, and certainly seen my share of successes and disappointments, some of which I'll touch on today. So the byline of this talk is connecting to shareholder value. And I've actually structured the presentation around this. The first part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the value part of that statement. And specifically, how do you identify the value of your project and decide if the project is worth doing? Because that's really the first stage gate in the whole process. If the project's not worth doing, then it's not worth having any of the rest of the conversation. So I'll talk a little bit about value creation. I'll talk about how you convince yourself that the project is worth doing. We'll look at different ways to identify the value and a little bit about how we can measure it. The second part, so once we know the value, then we actually have to convince someone, typically to provide us funding or resources, whether it's a VC or your boss at a corporation. So in the stakeholder section, we'll talk about who these people are, who is it that you need to convince, and what you need, what are the things that you need to think about in winning them over. And then the last part of the presentation, oops, little animation issue there. Okay, and the last part of the presentation, I'll bring it together in the connecting part. So in this section of the presentation, I'll talk about communicating the value that you've identified to the shareholders. Once you know what you expect.
Hey, Jonathan, the slides seem to have disappeared from the screen.
Okay. How's that?
Looking good.
Okay. I think I accidentally tapped a button on the laptop there. All right, so connecting, so the section on connecting, I'll be talking about how you communicate the value to the stakeholders. Once you figured out what the value is and who you need to convince, we'll talk a little bit about how you actually communicate that. All right, so let's dive into the first section. On value. And I'm going to lead off with this quote from Theodore Roosevelt, which is, "Far and away, the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at something worth doing." So if you can't convince yourself that this project is worth doing, then you're not going to convince anyone else. And frankly, if you can't convince yourself that it's worth doing, you're not going to be very motivated to do it. And whether you're working in a large corporation pitching at an annual planning cycle, or you're looking at something much smaller and just trying to figure out what you're working on the next sprint in an agile environment, or if you're pitching to an investor, if there isn't value there, then it's not worth taking up those resources. And I really want to stress that the project really needs to be really, truly worth doing, not just something that would be nice or nice to have, but what is it? What is the difference, the impact that this project is really going to make? The other thing is we think about project value is that identifying and unlocking that value is what's going to help your project go the distance as priorities shift within a corporation and an organization, because priorities do shift. You've got annual planning cycles, priorities change, money dries up, it might be quarterly cycles, leadership changes, all of these things happen, and understanding the value and how it connects to the corporate strategy is essential to making sure that you can ride out those changes. And just to bring this home, I think about one of the first projects that I did when I was at a consultancy in the early part of my career. We worked on a procurement system for a customer, so we were a consultancy. We were building this product for the customer. This was the customer's business, so this seemed like it was pretty important to them. We worked on it for over a year. The project was running late, and by the end we started canceling vacations, and people worked late. The team came together, and we were going to get it done, and we were going to get it done basically on time. And then 2 weeks before the project launched, the project was canceled. Customer never really explained. They just said, well, we really evaluated the market, and it's not worth it. So we were 2 weeks from the end, and they still pulled the plug. So, at the time, I wasn't really close enough to understand. I was more focused on, the how and not the what and the why. But it's definitely a lesson that I didn't forget. Also, keep in mind with the, is the project worth doing, that this is actually quite contextual. So worth doing isn't the same at a large company or a small company, or two companies in the same industry that have different priorities, or even for the same company at different points in time. So you really do need to think about, constantly reevaluate that and make sure it's still relevant and that you're keeping your project relevant if you do believe in it, which I hope you do. All right, so now that we've understood the importance of value, let's figure out how we do that. So I'll talk a little bit about who benefits. So if we talk about creating value, someone has to see the benefit of that value, so we'll talk about who that is. I'll talk a little bit about corporate strategy and a couple of models for evaluating and uncovering corporate strategy. The first one I'll talk about is a more traditional approach, and then I'll talk about something from the lean literature. And then lastly in this section, I'll talk a little bit about connecting it to goals and how some of the techniques that you can use to measure this, which later becomes important when you're ready to communicate it. All right, so starting with who benefits. The most obvious answer to this is the shareholder. And the shareholder is the company that you work for, the people who get, who have shares or who own parts of the company that you work for. And the most obvious form of benefit for them is financial, right? So if the product leads to making more money, hey, we're going to invest this much in the product, in the project, in the product, we're going to make this much money. Everybody's happy, everybody wins, so that seems pretty straightforward. And the shareholder value can come from revenue, it can come from growth, it can come from efficiencies in the way the company operates. But basically it's the company and the shareholder who reap the benefits. Also think about sales is another example of shareholder value. And on the flip side of that, also think about attrition and renewals. So that seems pretty straightforward in a large company or any privately owned company. There's other models where the shareholder as the person who benefits from the value is relevant. I mentioned consulting before. So if you're working for a consulting company, you can think about the value generated to your company, which is typically extending the project or new projects or word of mouth. And of course you can think about the value to your customer. And then there are internal projects. Internal projects sometimes seem more challenging to sell, but they also generate value. And if you can figure out what the value is for an internal project you're doing, whether it's financial or not, then you can also make a case for that project. Okay, so we've talked about shareholder. The next most obvious one is users. So think about who's using your product. And then think about the important thing with the user here is they're going to derive some benefit, but start thinking about how you're going to know that they're deriving benefit. Is it a little bit of a benefit or a significant amount of benefit? And I'll come back to this later, but with user benefit, you want to think about how that benefit is going to get captured. And that could be through renewals. If it's a subscription model, it's not canceling the subscription, so there's enough value that they're re-upping. Or maybe it's telling friends and recruiting new customers. So typically, the user is deriving value from your project in a B2C situation, also in a lot of B2B situations. Examples, it could, apps, gadgets, iPhones, anything you buy in a store. There's plenty of examples of where the user derives value. Otherwise, they wouldn't use your product. But before we finish the conversation on users, remember that the user is not necessarily the person who's paying for your product. So sometimes it is worth distinguishing the user from the customer. As a reminder, the user is the person who's using your product. The customer is the person who buys your product, who's paying for your product. In a B2C situation, it could be a parent or a friend. So if you're selling a product that's aimed, say, at 5th graders, there's a pretty good probability that the person you need to convince to purchase the product, and one of the people that need to derive value from the product is the parent. Think about friends. If you give a gift, the person making the purchasing decision is not the person who's using the product, but they need to understand the value either in the sense that it's going to make the receiver of the gift happy, or some value that they derive from the pleasure of giving that gift, or whatever else they get from giving that gift. Another group to consider when you're talking about customers is advertisers. So plenty of businesses are ad-funded these days, advertising-funded these days. The advertiser is getting value from your platform, or from your tool, or from your product. And so you need to think about the value that they derive, and are they going to purchase your product or lay value on your product by continuing to advertise. Also think about B2B2C, and this is most similar to the example that I led off with the individual who was trying to enhance the product, where the customer was a company buying the product, but the end user were employees of the platform, of the HR platform. So I talked about the HR portal as an example. Internal projects can also fit into this. So the customer, the person paying for it, is one person. The consumer is someone else. Okay, so this is who benefits. So now let's talk a little bit about how to identify, how do you find that value? So beyond just thinking about specifically who benefits, and I'm going to talk, as I said, I'm going to talk about 2 strategic frameworks. The first one is a little bit more traditional. If you've done an MBA, you've probably come across Porter's 5 Forces. It's a very old strategic framework. I mean, very old. It's a strategic framework that's been around for a while, so lots of business students and non-business students have studied it. And it's typically brought into the conversation when you're talking about competitive analysis. But I also find it very useful for talking about deriving value, because the two are very much connected. And when we talk about value, and this is where Porter's forces start to help us, we can think about financial value, which are the more obvious ones that I touched on before, and we can talk about strategic value. And when we talk about financial value, the interesting thing about financial value that I'll come back to later on when I talk about measuring is that measuring financial value is not always as obvious as you think it might be, especially when you're looking at an established project where you're making incremental benefits. So looking at the strategic frameworks kind of helps you figure out where that value might be, and also helps you think about how you might start to quantify it and measure it, because otherwise it's not so obvious. When you make incremental improvements, the and there's 15 other projects at the same time in your same company touching on your broader project, it can be difficult to tease out the difference between between your project and other projects. And I had many experiences with that when I was at American Express. And then the second is strategic. So consider your company's mission, your company's goals, your company's objectives. If you work at a large company, I would expect that your CEO and your leadership are regularly at least once a year and maybe once a quarter, are reinforcing the company mission, the company values, and the company objectives. And they've probably taken it from, okay, here's our company mission. So at American Express, our mission was to be the most respected service brand in the world. But then every year, the CEO would break that down into a bunch of, generally about 5 sort of key initiatives or 5 key themes that were the focus for the year. So if you understand those key themes, someone's done that work for you, and if you can tie into those, then you're already sort of 2 steps ahead in the process of connecting to the value that someone who's funding your project is going to care about. In small companies, it's not always so obvious because small companies aren't always as good at defining them. Some do, some have it very clearly laid out, and others not so much, so you kind of have to figure it out for yourself. So another point before I dive into this model is always remember that when you're pitching your project, it's not just about your project. There are a lot of other people competing for money, or money or time or resources. When you're in a large organization, you might be going through an annual funding cycle, and it isn't just a question of saying, hey, my project is deriving value and it's positive in terms of the investment, will generate more money than we spend. It's also about the fact that, well, someone else's project is also generating more money that they spend, and it's even generating more money than yours, or more value, or whatever that measure is. And when I think about this, I always think back to the story of the 2 campers who were walking along, and a bear shows up, and the first camper stops to tie his put on his sneakers and tie his shoelaces, and the second one says, why are you putting on sneakers? It's not going to help you outrun the bear. And the first camper replies, well, I don't have to outrun the bear. I only have to outrun you. And in most environments where you're pitching your project, that's always a consideration. Sometimes it's explicit and sometimes it's not. Again, in a large corporation, everyone's pitching a dozen projects and only some of them will get funded. If you're pitching a VC, VCs get requests all the time. And even if you're in a startup, there's very limited resources, and it may not be as formal a process as saying, I'm going to look at 10 projects and pick the best one. But whoever is going to green light your project, in the back of their mind, I guarantee that they're thinking, well, I could do this, but I've got these 5 other, but is it really more valuable than the next thing that I'm expecting to come along? So keep in mind that that's always in the background.
So Jonathan, we just had a question come in from Amanda, so I'm going to hand over to Amanda to ask her question.
Hi, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for
Great.
it.
Sorry, I had problems with my mic last time. One of the challenges, I guess, is always how do you balance what is value for different stakeholders. So value from a shareholder perspective might be stripping out cost, and that's not necessarily going to be the same value for a user or customer. So what's the framework or process you use to try and balance those differing value drivers?
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you identify the value for some of the different stakeholders. For instance, what is the shareholder value? Where is the revenue coming from, or the growth? But ultimately, in terms of arbitrating between those two, if that's your question, that goes back to the point I was making before about corporate objectives, right? So you need to start from a position of what's important to my company right now? What's important to my CEO? What's important to my business unit leader, whoever that is? And hopefully they've already made that clear to you. If they haven't, then you're kind of you're kind of without a net, and it's always dangerous territory. But if they've laid out those three strategic objectives, and what you're trying to tie into isn't one of those things, then you may want to rethink the project. That may not be the right project to do right now. Or you may want to reframe your project in terms of one of those objectives, right? So at American Express, for instance, customer service was always an important value. And one of the ways that that my group, which was focused on providing a platform for managing the account, the way we pitched a lot of those projects was either we were going to increase customer satisfaction because that was something that the leadership of the company tracked, or we were going to drive costs out of the call centers. So we were going to maybe have not necessarily fewer calls, but fewer calls about the wrong things, and so that we could have more time to talk to customers about the right things. So those were important values, and so I could tie into those. And I didn't necessarily have to tie into, we're going to generate more revenue for the company. But that's not the case for every company, so you kind of got to figure out which are the ones that are relevant in your situation.
Great, thank you.
Great, great. So that's all the questions I have at the moment, but everyone please keep your questions coming in. And to do that, just go to theproductmentor.com/live, and as they come in, I'll pass them along to Jonathan. With that said, back to you, Jonathan.
Okay. So I think that's actually a good place to jump into to Porter's 5 Forces. So as I said with Porter's 5 Forces, it's kind of a strategic framework for looking at the competitive aspect of the market, but it's also useful in this conversation. So I'll just quickly go through some of the elements on the chart here, and as you can see there are 5 boxes, 5 forces, 5 boxes. So the first one is supplier power. So suppliers are the suppliers to you as the business. If you're manufacturing widgets, they may be providing raw materials. It could be that you're creating a website, but you've got vendors who are actually doing the development, so then they could be suppliers. Any of those things are suppliers. And suppliers are really important to the business because they're a source of cost, and they're also a source of competitive, or either competitive advantage or a position of weakness. So if managing suppliers is important to your business, then a project that's going to somehow evolve that relationship with suppliers could be important. If managing the supply chain is important, maybe a product that makes that easier to do or more efficient or requires fewer people to do it could help. If it puts you in a position of strength where maybe you don't need a supplier that you needed to before because now it's easier to do things internally. So let's say a content management platform, maybe before you had to hire a bunch of vendors and people to key in a lot of information for you, now you eliminate that need because marketing managers can key in and update the website by themselves, and that's going to maybe save money. Or maybe it's not even about the money, it's about the marketing managers being able to deliver things to market a lot more quickly. So that's supplier power. The next one is buyer power. This can be especially important in a B2B context. So think about what choices customers or buyers have, how many you have. Are any of your customers the elephant in the room, or any of your customers likely to drive the direction of your business? If that's the case, if you're, and again, this ties back to your corporate strategy. So some companies are going to say, we're trying to create something for the masses, and if we have big customers, we may try and accommodate them, but not to the point of taking us away from our core mission and solving something for everyone. In other cases, it's basically it's more of a consultancy basis, and you're willing to make a lot of accommodations for those large customers. So if you're doing something that's important to the large customer, and it's going to lead them to spend more money with you, or maybe it's going to keep them from walking away, then that could be something strategically that's very important that your leadership is going to care about. And you see this all the time in big companies and small companies. And next one is competitive rivalry. So think about how many competitors there are in your market, and how strong they are. If you're in a competitive situation, will the project put you in a stronger position? So thinking back to the example that I led off with, adding those features in the HR portal is it going to make a difference to the competitive position? Are there a lot of competitors who are where it's easy to switch between the two, and maybe those employers who are hiring you, you know, if those additional features were added, then they would, you know, they would stick with you, or they might leave you for someone else who's already doing it. Usability enhancements can be an example of this. So think about, particularly in a premium product space, think about Apple and, you know, iPhones and all the Apple products. You know, they've staked a claim in terms of making usability a priority, premium a priority, privacy a priority. So anything that they're doing to help differentiate themselves from their competitors strengthens that position and distances them from other competitors in the marketplace.
So Jonathan, we just had a question come in, and this question I'm going to hand it over to Sam to ask his question. Sam?
Hey Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Hey. So it kind of goes back to your value slide where you had shareholders, user, and advertisers and advertising. And it's kind of about when you're trying to convince like the hard-pressing advertisers in your company that maybe user experience trumps like the branding, the messaging from sponsors that they want to put in your product. So for an example, like let's say you have a new release and you know they have a big sponsor that wants to come on board, but it's really, really threatening the UX and the user flow right at the beginning, where you'd rather focus on, you know, gathering new users. And how do you really, without lots of evidence and without a real case for UX, how do you really approach those advertisers there?
Yeah, I mean, so my answer actually is going to be similar to my previous answer, which is that a lot of it involves tying back to the values of the company. So
okay.
Are the values of the company, you know, it's all about monetizing, or are you trying to create something, you know, are they looking a little bit further out and looking beyond the next quarter? Because if the company is locked in a, you know, the next quarter, that's going to be a really hard uphill battle. It's not impossible, but it's a really hard uphill battle. It can be fought, but you're going to need to probably do a lot of research, look for a lot of examples, and try and run some numbers that basically say, well, you know, usability, you know, products with this usability have higher engagement over time. That translates to more eyeballs, but it's going to take, you know, 18 months for that to play out. And if you can make a strong enough case that, you know, that usability translates, in this example, to eyeballs, translates to more advertising revenue, then you can overcome it. In some cases, it may also require you to develop some allies, which actually I'll be talking about a little bit later, and having people, you know, having someone to kind of back you up and say, yeah, I agree with this, and this makes sense. So I'll talk a little bit more about allies later, but that's another strategy that you can apply.
Okay, thanks.
If the company is really short-sighted, then maybe you want to think about a different company, especially if it doesn't align with, you know, with your own values and what you're doing.
Sure.
Awesome. Yeah, you might be left with very few companies to choose from. So you
can try. Depending on your situation in the company, right? You can help push that forward, but it's easier from some positions than others, right? If you're senior VP of something, it's a lot easier to influence that. At entry level, you've got to convince a lot more people that it's worth doing. So then you have to decide whether you know, you want to spend the next few years of your life fighting that battle, or going someplace where, you know, the battle is largely won and you can kind of focus on the next step. And that, you know, it's not that one is better or worse, but it depends how you want to spend your time.
Definitely.
Sure.
So that's all the questions I've got right now. But again, everyone, keep your questions coming in to theproductmentor.com/live. People in the room, people from the rest of the internet, feel free to send in your questions there on that page, and we'll pass them along to Jonathan. Back to you, Jonathan.
Okay, so I talked about competitive rivalry, and the next one is threat of substitutes. And actually, these are a little bit related. So I talked about before that if there are competitors, how easy is it for you to, for your customers to jump ship? You know, with some products, that's very easy, right? Cola Wars, you know, I buy a Coke today, I buy a Pepsi tomorrow. Switching costs are basically non-existent. Big corporate systems, the migration is much more difficult. There's a lot of data to move. There's a lot of retraining. So while you may look at something like usability and say, well, hey, this is going to make our end users experience a lot better, and it's going to make us look better in the marketplace, you know, if you've already got a large portion of the market and maybe you're winning on features even though your usability is not great, you may not feel great about that, but if you take a really hard look at what you're trying to achieve, you may realize that it may impact your users' lives, but it may not impact the values that your company cares about. Because at the end of the day, it's like, well, are we gonna close more sales? No. Are we gonna attract more customers? No. We're gonna keep getting this, you know, as long as we want. So, you know, is it really worth doing? And you know, if what you really care is UX and you want to work at a company that cares about UX, then, you know, work at one of those companies. Work at Apple. Work at one of the myriad of startups who are building these gorgeous apps for mobile devices that are really paying attention to that. And then the last one is another thing. Another point about the threat of substitution. The jobs to be done framework, if you've heard of that, that can be useful here. So thinking about the jobs that people are doing. Also think about the substitutes that people already have, because that may indicate a market. So if people are already solving their problem in a certain way, you know, that may tell you that there's a need, or it may tell you that the problem is sufficiently solved and they're not going to do it. And also think about whether people really want you to do this. So at American Express, for instance, we spent some time and actually implemented a solution for personal finance management where you could consolidate all your finances in one place. And after we rolled it out, we talked to customers and we learned that it's not that they didn't want to do that, it's just they didn't want to do it with their credit card company. So we were never going to win that. And so threat of new entrants, so, you know, the question to ask here is, can someone do it better? You know, is there an established player in the market who can jump in? You know, can Google turn around tomorrow and say, you know what, we want to play there and make whatever you're going to do irrelevant? Or do you have an opportunity to create barriers that's going to further distance you from competitors in this market? So that's a little bit about Porter's 5 forces. And now I'm going to switch to something a little bit more recent. So this is called the Business Model Canvas. It's sort of part of the lean space. And there's a lot of overlap here, but it's a different way to lay it out and structure it. And there are other models as well. I just wanted to introduce a couple and give you some tools that may be relevant depending on where you work. So here you've got some of the areas to look at here. And again, the objective is to identify value. So key activities, what are the important activities? And I'm on the sort of the second column here. What are the important activities that are important in executing your company's mission? So again, this is where you're thinking about vision. The vision of your company, the mission of your company. What are the key goals that your leaders have outlined for the year? If you can tie it to one of those, relate it to one of those, then you may be onto something that's worth talking about. Right below that, key resources. So what are the resources that your company uses? They could be human resources, financial resources, physical, intellectual capital. What are those resources, and how will your project either create value for those resources, or maybe help the company derive more value, more efficiency out of using those resources, maybe use them more effectively. Over to the left, the key partnerships. So in addition to suppliers, the company has partnerships, and these can be really important. So if your company has strategic partnerships and doing this project strengthens those partnerships, that there's all sorts of benefits that can derive from that. Either, some of it could be goodwill. It may also open new markets for you. It may increase the visibility. So there's a lot of things that you can tie into that. And the point here, again, is that some strategic goals can be just as important as quantitative and financial goals. Thinking about the value proposition, think about what the value proposition is really what distinguishes your company from your competitors. So think about things like newness, performance, customization, design, brand, price, reduction of risk, right? So there's the old adage about no one ever got fired for hiring IBM. Whatever those things are, understand those, and if you can tap into them, that may be a core value for your company and something that's a good source of identifying value for your project. And again, remember that some of these can be quantitative, like price and efficiency. Some of them can be qualitative, like strategy or customer experience or customer outcomes. So speaking of customers, I'll jump to the right here on customer segments. And here you want to think about, how will this help you tap into your existing customer segments or maybe open up new customer segments? So think about market expansion or product extensions. Is your market, do you have a mass market product? You're going to think about it one way. If you have a niche product, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to get a lot more specific. I'm not planning to talk a lot today about marketplaces and multi-sided platforms, but there, the value creation, because it's multi-sided, right? You think about the value creation both for suppliers and buyers in your marketplace, and the way that you monetize that value or that you capture that value is different, right? In some cases, it may be eyeballs, it may be getting more people onto the platform, it may be extending word of mouth. In other cases, it's actually getting people to spend money on your platform. Customer relationships, think about how you relate to customers. So I talked about American Express customer service is really important. Does your business run on selling products? Do you manage, do you do a lot of personal assistance? Is it a concierge type service? Is it an automated service? Do you rely on communities? Or maybe you have something, like a blog platform or Medium where you rely a lot on co-creation. So who are you creating value for there? Something like Medium, more people writing, making the platform easier to write on means more people are going to be writing, means that there's more content, more interesting content, which should then lead to more eyeballs on the platform. And you can, once you break that down, then you can, then you can quantify and explain it. Channels, so the right below customer relationships. Think about the channels that you're in. That could be physical channels like stores and mail order. It could be web. It could be in-app purchases. So can you increase in-app purchases? Again, advertising, search. So generally here you want to think about, will your project improve the reach of your product? Will it open up new channels, or will it make you more efficient in your current channels? And then along the bottom, you've got cost structure, which I'll talk a little bit about, a little bit more about in a minute. But are you a cost-driven business? And so anything that's going to drive down those costs is going to be important to you. So like Southwest Airlines, right? Everything is about efficiency. Or are you value-driven, right? So iPhone, so it's not about lowering costs, it's about increasing value or brand or perception. And then, so that's your cost structure. So if you can reduce costs, that's deriving value. And then the obvious revenue stream. So this is everything related to how you make money. Okay, so having talked about a couple of frameworks and sort of give you some ideas of where you can go fishing, as it were, for the value in your projects, let's talk a little bit about how we can capture it, measure it, and convey it. So one common tool is the cost-benefit analysis, and this has different names in different companies. I've seen the abbreviation CBA for cost-benefit analysis. You may hear people talk about fancy financial models like net present value, although that's not necessary in a lot of cases, and companies that use it typically will help you with it. You just need to figure out what the inputs are. That's your job. The idea of the cost-benefit analysis, though, is to essentially demonstrate that the project, that the benefits of the project outweigh the costs. And so there's two sides to the equation. One is you stack up all the benefits that you can think of. You do want to think about both the qualitative and the quantitative, although I'll focus on the quantitative for now. And then you look at the costs, and again, those can be both qualitative and quantitative. And hopefully, if it's positive, then you've crossed your first hurdle. And then, as I said, you have to beat all the other projects. If it's negative, it may still be worth doing, but not for financial reasons. All right, so we can talk about revenue. List a few of those out. So you've got sales, subscription fees, usage fees, like say UPS, Advertising we talked about, so those are the most obvious and common ones that tend to jump to mind. In other kinds of business, you might think about asset sales, like sharing ownership rights to physical goods, or closing stores. Lending, leasing, renting models, brokerage fees, licensing. So these are all sources of revenue. And really try and, to use a well-worn phrase, think out of the box at all the different ways that your company makes money, not the most obvious ones, right? So, if you're in the iPhone division of Apple, don't just think about, the sale of the iPhone itself and the revenue you get from that. Think about the revenue that they get from apps in the App Store, for example, right? And again, try and expand it because you may uncover some really interesting opportunities that way or ways of justifying it. So the second area is growth. So how can you grow the business? Either more customers, new markets, parallel markets, new partnerships, all of those things. So the next one is reduce costs. Now notice I've got reduce costs in the benefits column because driving costs out of the business can be really important, again, especially for value-based businesses. I mentioned Southwest before. Any large corporation is always trying to reduce their overhead and reduce their costs. And anything that you can do to do that essentially releases more money and more funding to do other things in the business, or more people resources. In terms of reducing costs, you can typically think about fixed costs. These are things like salaries, rents, what you pay for to run buildings, to run facilities, data centers. Typically those are either fixed or they're step. So those are harder to reduce directly on a project unless you can do them on a big scale. But then variable costs are typically much more tied to a project. So, if it costs you, 5 cents to sell 10 cents in advertising, and you can reduce that from 5 cents to 4 cents, when you multiply that by a big number, that starts to look really interesting. And then another benefit is generally improving efficiencies. So, this is where you talk about things like economies of scale. So, as costs go up, or costs go down as the quantity goes up, or the cost per unit goes down as quantity goes up. Economies of scope, so the costs go down because you're incorporating other businesses or tying things together. Okay, so those are, you're stacking up all the benefits, and again, to that you want to add the qualitative benefits and the strategic benefits. On the cost side of the equation, typically the first thing you're going to look at is what is the cost of running your project. So it's going to take money. Big company, usually you add a few zeros onto the cost of a project compared to a small company, but the decision process is largely the same. Money is going to be pumped into your project. It's going to take a certain number of people. They have salaries. It may take consultants. They have to be paid. Those are variable costs. The employee costs are usually fixed costs. You may need to buy resources. You may need computer time. You may need to hire a marketing agency. All the costs associated with running the project, once you've spent them, you never get that money back. So that's going to sort of count against you, as it were, in the equation. The next one is marketing and operations costs. So most of the time, it's not worth doing something if you're not prepared to talk about it and spend some money doing it. There are the lucky businesses that rely on word of mouth, although even word of mouth generally requires some effort, even if it's fixed costs of someone at the company encouraging the word of mouth and getting the word out and spreading it. So there's generally costs. There's always some kind of marketing cost to getting it out there. And then the operations cost, which is, think about once you launch this project or you launch this feature, what is it going to cost to maintain it afterwards? So are people going to call, and you're going to have more calls to the call center to offset the benefits? Do you have to add a server, and so now you have to pay the ongoing server costs? Those are just a couple of examples, but just remember that, or for that matter, maintenance. So you release a feature and that's great and everyone's excited about it, and then you're going to have a stream of defects come in that you're going to have to go back and fix if you're doing a software project. So remember that even after you launch the project, there are ongoing costs, and even if you're not thinking about it, you can bet that someone else is. And then the last one is opportunity costs. So I mentioned that you're competing with other projects. that money and also that time could be used elsewhere, and so you remember that you're competing with that. All right, now on some of the less quantitative stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about measuring user value. So the first one, a big one, is customer satisfaction. So if you're in a business that cares about customer satisfaction, I would argue that all businesses should care about customer satisfaction, but some value businesses, don't care so much about it. For most other businesses, customer satisfaction is going to lead to recommendations. It's going to lead to more business. It's going to lead to renewals, so you care. Tying it back to say, this difference in customer satisfaction equals this many more dollars. You can do it sometimes. It's challenging in other situations. There are tools that will help you do it. But in any case, you can measure customer satisfaction, and you can measure a change in customer satisfaction and talk about that as an objective. So you can say, my satisfaction went from A to B, and let's talk about whether that improvement is worthwhile. So surveys are an important tool here. If you typically, when you do surveys and you ask people to give you a rating or their level of satisfaction, that's often done on a 5-point scale. And then you'll see you can set a target, for an aggregate number, but you can also do what's called top box or top 2 box, where if your scale is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's usually starting from excellent, very good, good, not so good, and poor. So top box basically says I want to get as many people into that top category, that excellent category, as possible. So that's typically an ambitious goal. Other companies might do top 2 box, which is to say I want to get them in either the very good or the excellent. Don't forget to look at the other side of it. So look at the bottom box. So that's a number that you want to drive down. If you have a lot of people in the poor giving you a poor rating, and you can say, hey, you know what, I've got 20% of customers give me a poor rating, and I can get that from 20% to 15% or 10%, that's worth something too. So don't just look at the top number, look at the bottom number. And then you can look at recommend to a friend, which is where that, where your customers are helping you get the word out. And typically that's measured on a 10-point scale, and a 9 and a 10 is where you get the real mileage. Which brings me to Net Promoter. So Net Promoter is a measure that's been used a fair amount, particularly in companies that care about customer service. It's a little bit controversial. Not everyone believes that it's everything it's cracked up to be, but it is a useful measure because it's a single number that summarizes everything, and there's a very simple calculation for it. Recommend to a friend basically takes Net Promoter basically takes the 10-point recommend to a friend score. You consider all the 9s and 10s to be promoters, so those are the people that are your cheerleaders. The 7 and 8s are basically happy with your product, but they're not necessarily going to be shouting about it, so they're kind of neutrals. And the 6s and belows are considered detractors, so they're the ones that you're worried would actually spread negative information about you. So you subtract the detractors from the promoters, and you get a number. Typically, that's on a scale from -100 to 100. And you can compare that to other industries and other people in your industry. 30 is actually considered pretty good on that scale. It's a challenging scale, and the best in the world are usually somewhere in the neighborhood of like a 70. But those are like meteoric scores. And then the last thing to consider is substitutes. I talked a little bit about this before, but think about what your customers are doing today. And those substitutes can either indicate that there's a strong need and that people are struggling to solve their problem today, and that's if you can quantify how much those substitutes are being used and how much of that you can capture, then that's actually something that you can quantify from a user value standpoint. On the other hand, you may, when you dig a little bit further, you may find that people are perfectly happy with those substitutes, and it may be time to go on to the next thing. So I will end this section with another quote. Every sale has 5 basic obstacles: no need, no money, no hurry, no desire, and no trust. And so what I've covered so far talks to the no need, the lack of need, the lack of money, and the lack of urgency, and hopefully some of the things we've talked about will help you address those. And in the next section, as I talk about stakeholders, we'll talk about lack of desire and lack of trust. So And that was, by the way, that was the longest section because the value is really the linchpin to this whole thing. So the rest builds off of value. So stakeholders, the first thing with stakeholders is think about the different types of stakeholders. The one that you're going to think about first are the decision makers, right? So this is the person that you're pitching your project to. It could be the venture capitalist, it could be your boss or your boss's boss, depending on the situation, or even a colleague that you're just trying to get you to help you out with something. But you have to look beyond the decision makers. Influencers are incredibly important, and they may or may not be in the room when you're pitching your idea, but behind the scenes, they could be helping you, or they could be completely sandbagging your project. So you want to think about who else has, who has the decision maker's ear, who is influencing their decisions, and how can you be aware of that, and how can you tap into it. And then secondary stakeholders are other people who have a vested interest. They may have an opinion. They may be able to make your life easier or harder to do the project. They're also interesting because sometimes if you can get them on your side, you can actually drive down the cost or the difficulty of doing your project because they may have some common interests with you. So if we look at some examples of that, right, the most obvious ones are your boss, your boss's boss, your boss's boss's boss, whoever it is, head of your department, your CEO, whoever it is, that is probably making the decision or at least has a lot of influence over the outcome of the decision. If if you're pitching a VC, for instance, then it's a VC, or you're going for investment or capital, same thing. So the next here is think about all of the departments in your organization, and I've listed only a few here, but sales, marketing, engineering, customer support, operations, they may have a vested interest in the way things are done now, or they may just think that your idea sounds cool, but not so easy to do, and they're going to be dragging their feet the whole way. So I can't tell you the number of times that this has come up when we talk about search for web platforms. So every web platform, kind of needs to have a search so you can find content. Everyone's used to Google, so the typical thing to do is to say, I want to search just like Google. And then the engineers typically say, that's great. Hire me 100 PhDs like Google and a year or a couple of years, and we can talk about it. So you want to work with them and get them on your side and figure out what's feasible and achievable. So engineering is an example, but marketing and sales, operations, again, I talked about, once you roll out your feature, once you roll out your project, that may have an impact on customer support, it may have an impact on operations, and you want to understand those impacts and how it impacts your project, so you can anticipate their concerns and hopefully get them on your side. And then, of course, don't forget your colleagues. They can be a great source of knowledge and information, and they can help you out a lot, or again, they can hinder you. In terms of how you identify these people, some of them will be obvious to you, some will require more thought, and some you'll never think of on your own. So this is where research and conversations and informational interviewing is really important. Talk to as many people as you can. They will raise questions and concerns that you might not have thought about, and that will lead you to other stakeholders, and you may find some unexpected allies and detractors in those groups. So don't forget to do that. It can have a huge impact on the outcome of the decision outcome of your project.
So Jonathan, we've got some questions that have come in. I'm going to hand the first one over to Vikas.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
All right, a couple of questions, both on the quantitative analysis that you talked about. First question is, based on your experience, what metric have you seen being used? Under what conditions? Is it NPV or ROI or payback period, or what other metrics you've seen? And then the second piece is, if you're doing a comparison between two projects, or if you're doing like a portfolio decision where you're trying to decide across multiple projects, what is your experience in terms of making sure that the assumptions that have been made in each one of those cost-benefit analysis or business cases are somewhat equally aggressive or equally conservative?
I've seen, in terms of what metrics, I've seen a host of different metrics, and it really depends. larger corporations that have finance departments will typically do some kind of a net present value or discounted cash flow analysis. But typically there'll be people who can help you with the mechanics of it. NPV is basically just math. The hard part of NPV or the cost-benefit analysis in any form is figuring out the inputs, not the outputs. And then you gut check the outputs, and you can do some you can run some scenarios.
So for those joining, what you said, MPV? What is
NPV, net present value. It's basic net present value. Takes it's like the future dollar, what it's worth today. So if I gave you $1 a year from now, that would be worth 90 cents to you today, in very simple terms. It's a way of it's a financial analysis model. It's the way companies value future work. So typically they'll say, well, it's going to cost me $100 to do this now. I'll get $200 of revenue a year from now, but the benefit of that is not 200 minus 100. It's a little bit less than that because in the simplest case, you could just take that $100 and invest it in the bank, and you'd probably, you'd make some money. So that's NPV in very simple terms. But they will a company that's using NPV that sort of is thinking in that way will be able to help you with it in a lot of roles, particularly in a product management role. It's not that hard if you want to look it up. The critical part, and this is the part that you need to understand and you need to fight for, is what are the inputs into that? What gets considered? Again, a big company may have a bit of a template, so they'll say, what are the marketing costs? What are the operations costs? What are the project costs? What are the revenue opportunities? What are the incremental revenue opportunities? What are all those things? And they'll have categories that will help you along. Sometimes what you want to talk about may not be in one of those categories, and your job is to really figure out what is the most important thing you want to talk about and make sure it gets into that assessment and that calculation. And when you're doing the obvious ones, again, in a large company, they may be able to help you pull numbers to help make your case and validate that you're using those numbers correctly. But when you go off the reservation a little bit, that may require more effort on your part to figure out how to quantify it. And you may have to back into it. You may have to do, those exercises where you say, how many golf balls fit into a 747. So there's a variety of techniques for doing that. Whether it's saying, well, I talked about substitutes before. Well, if you look at our potential customers, this percentage of them are doing this particular substitute. I've talked to a bunch of them, and on that basis, I think that conservatively I can get 5% of them to do it to switch over to my product, and even 5% represents, multiplied by enough people, represents this much money. When you do that, look at some high, medium, low scenarios. If you can, be conservative, because people are going to question your assumptions. So you can at least say, well, I think this is a very conservative estimate. ROI is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, right? Your ROI is return on investment. You invest for a certain amount of dollars, how much are you going to get back? But ROI sometimes is not always quantitative, right? The return can be a qualitative return as well. And in terms of comparing like for like in a portfolio, the best thing you can do is understand how the company values things. Again, in a large corporation, someone will probably sanity check. There's someone who's in the finance department to sanity check what you're proposing, and so you want to make sure that they're not taking you down the wrong path, but they'll do it for you. In a smaller company or a company that doesn't have a dedicated finance function, the important thing is to understand how your company values those things and try and come up with a number that people believe. You probably won't be aware of how every other project does it, but if you know someone who's successfully pitched a project, you can ask to see what they've done and see how they've measured things, and that's another good approach as well.
Great. I'm going to hand over the next question to Anthony.
So this question goes back to the slide that you had on balancing value and costs. When deciding to, say, take a custom request, it's easy to see the upfront and well quantified value, essentially the money that the client's willing to pay. But I find it's a lot harder to see and quantify the kinds of hidden costs. I think you touched on it a little bit, but things like managing added complexity to your product, that's kind of small, but then ends up kind of feeling like death by a thousand pricks when you take on so many of these things. What are the best ways to understand and quantify these hidden costs so you can decide whether it's a worthy request to take on, and also to kind of have that conversation with the sales team or leadership around whether it's good to take on these custom features?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is beware of analysis paralysis. So this is a sales job in the sense that what you're trying to do is you're trying to prove to yourself that this is worth doing, and then you're trying to prove to someone else that it's worth doing. So you need to do enough work to get over that hurdle, and probably not a lot more than that, because then you're just going to be wasting your time, and the return on investment in that time may not be worth it because it's not going to move things that significantly. And again, what's important here is the costs and the benefits that the company cares about. So Zappos may not care that you reduce the time, the average call handling time in their call center. So you can spend all day till you're blue in the face talking about how you're going to improve the efficiency of the customer service staff, and they just may not care. So try to focus on the things that are relevant in your business. So either you see a huge opportunity, it's such a big number that you're going to make a case for it, or you go fishing where in the areas that the company is already talking about, that your leaders are already talking about, that you hear other leaders in the company talking about. Those are probably the things that they care about, and those are the things that they're going to tune into.
Great, great. So as always, keep the questions coming in at theproductmentor.com/live, and back to you, Jonathan.
Okay. So allies. This is a quote from John F. Kennedy. Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. And this actually really applies to the office as well, right? So, sitting in the same cube or in the same company or in the same department makes you neighbors. Your shared experience makes you, hopefully friends. The business and the economics makes you partners, and the necessity of your project or their goals and objectives are what going to make you allies. So in terms of who are important as allies, again, think about the influencers. Go out, do your interviews, talk to people. If someone is a potential positive influencer, maybe someone else is going to benefit or see or understand the benefit of your project, or maybe it's someone who is higher up in the company whose voice is going to be respected. Sometimes if you can get the right SVP to buy into your project, all they have to do is open their mouth and say, I agree with this, and you don't actually need to say anything else. So if you think that you have an easier sell to that person, talk to them first before you do your final pitch, your more formal pitch. Understand what people care about. They may have different their department, their group, or if it's an external partnership, they may have different motivations and different things that they're trying to optimize for, different value that they're trying to lock in. If you understand what those are, there may be alliances that you can form on that basis where what you're doing is going to also help them out. Allies can also help you find more people to talk to, find information. In a lot of companies, information is locked away or difficult to access. Either it's in data centers that only certain people or databases only certain people can access, or it's just no one knows how to do it, and it requires a developer to go in and prioritize it. Or the data is there and it's been calculated, but you're not aware of it. So they can help you find that information and gather it. They can help you understand who the other influencers are. And help you sort of avoid being blindsided by someone who may be a detractor from your project. If you can anticipate their concerns, then you can get ahead of that and hopefully at least be prepared to respond, and in the best circumstance, maybe even turn that other individual into your ally. Allies are also good because they're great sounding boards. So maybe they might be willing to review your presentation or your pitch ahead of time and give you feedback on it and help you improve it. So all good reasons and many more to look at allies, to look for allies. Yeah, again, with stakeholders, remember to think about motivation. So your stakeholders may be motivated by similar corporate objectives: revenue, growth, reducing costs, improving efficiency. So all these things that we've been talking about: saving money, saving time. But don't forget the less obvious ones. Being associated with this project or not may improve their standing in the organization, their visibility. It may be, or using their influence for your project, they may be putting themselves on the line, and that may be something they want to do, or it may be something they don't want to do. So you should be aware of that. Their success and their credibility could be tied in, whether they're an ally or not, to this project, or you may be doing something that undermines them. So make sure that you, when you think about stakeholder motivation, that you think about all the motivations, not just the shareholder corporate type motivations. So I'll end this section by reminding us that we all have 2 ears, 1 mouth, and that we should listen twice as much as we speak. So this is really all about listening, understanding, researching, and all those conversations are really important. Paul talked about parachuting into the project, and he talked a bit about this in his presentation. I think he did a great job, so I won't dwell on it here. Okay, so the last section is communicating the value, and I'm just going to remind you again that everyone is selling something. I learned that in my first job. I've broadened sort of my understanding of it since then, and I just want to remind everyone that a product manager is a sales job, even though I don't like to think of myself as a salesman, but I have to constantly convince my leaders that the project is worth doing, and reminding them that it's still worth doing. I have to convince my team that it's worth putting their energy and focus onto the project. I have to work with marketing and convince our customers to pay attention to what I'm doing. So in some form, understanding that value and being able to communicate it and sell it, as it were, is really, it is part of your job. If you're not thrilled about it, I think you're going to have to accept it. Sort of get your head around it, but and come to terms with what that means to you. And it's not necessarily, in fact, it's not a negative thing. But you definitely want to come to terms with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, in this section, just a little bit about actually selling or constructing and delivering the message. So we'll talk about how to formulate it, how to structure it, and then some tips on delivering. So there's a great resource which is I listed at the end of the presentation, called Guide to Presentations. And one of the key features that I love about this is it's a really small, easy read. And I sort of keep it in my reference library. And she talks about this model called AIM, which is Audience, Intent, and Message. So, audience dovetails a lot with stakeholders, but the key point about audience is that you want to get your basic message down, but remember that you probably will need to adapt it to different audiences. Different audiences care about different things. Different stakeholders care about different things. And so you may want to focus a little bit more on certain aspects and less on other aspects, depending on who you're talking to and the situation. Intent is thinking about what is the intent of your presentation. Presentations typically fall into 4 categories. It could be a tell, where you're trying to inform someone of maybe a project update. Sell, which is really the most relevant to this conversation, where you're trying to persuade someone. And then there are consultative and joining presentations, where it's more of a conversation. And then the message is thinking about what are the key points that you want to convey. And to convey those points, which I'll talk a little bit more about the structure in a minute, but think about some of the supportive materials and how you're going to reinforce your point. What are some of the metrics? What is maybe how are competitors doing? What are the benchmarks? when you think about what you're asking for, sometimes it's better to ask for a little bit less and lowball it just to get your foot in the door. In other cases, you want to ask for a little bit more so that you can then say, okay, well, what if I just do this? Sometimes it's good to offer up a few alternatives so people don't feel locked into a decision, and then you can say, but my preferred one is this, and here's why. You can also talk about limited opportunities and urgency and some of those things. All right. So thinking a little bit about structure, and this is audience attention in a typical presentation. So typically audience attention is very high and focused at the beginning, and then it kind of wanes, and then as you get towards the end, people kind of perk up and they start listening again because if they realize that they're almost done. And I am almost done. So remember that audience attention is a limited resource. And so given that people are going to tune out, in almost all cases, it's best to lead with your core message so that if people tune out after the first 5 minutes, they've still got the point of your presentation. After that, so you key point, and then sort of your key supporting arguments, and then everything is going to refer back to that. That way, if they wane, they'll still come up with it, and then you'll summarize it at the end. Because there are different types of presentations, and I said most of the time this is the way to go. If you have a hostile audience, people who are really going to be give you a hard time, you may want to sort of gently ease into it, but that's very, very rare, and you really have to think hard as to whether that's necessary. So if you lay out the key themes. And this looks like, today I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to justify it by saying A, B, and C. And then you remind people where you are in that presentation. Now I've covered A, now I'm going to talk about B. I've covered B, now I'm going to talk about C. That helps people know where they are in the presentation. It helps them process and understand the information more easily. It will make your argument more effective and easier to understand, and will help people remember the key points. Key points, typically 3 to 5. Any more than that, more than 5, people won't remember them. And it's helpful for you also to just distill it and know what your own key points are. So this is really helpful because it helps you get organized. It helps you get organized. It helps you adapt, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And it'll help you do it more. So just to give you an example of this, I'm actually going to tie this back to my presentation. So my presentation I laid out in 3 key parts. I said I'm going to talk about values, stakeholders, and connecting, communicating. And if you take a minute now and you think about how we went through the presentation, at several points throughout the presentation I reminded you that that's what I was doing and that's what we were trying to convey. And I'm even doing it now because I'm tying my example of my presentation back to the presentation itself. So it can feel a little bit awkward or weird at first, but it's actually a very effective technique, and it really does help people to process the information. Okay, next point is be ready. So you've heard of the elevator pitch. The elevator pitch, this is when you walk into an elevator and your boss is there, or your boss's boss, or maybe even your group vice president, and you've got the 30 to 90 seconds while you're in the elevator to make a pitch. They may say, "Oh, what are you working on?" Or they may say, "Okay, go. You've got a minute to tell me about it." If you've organized your presentation, you know your key message, you know your 3 to 5 points, you can deliver them in 30 to 90 seconds. And hopefully, if you've been effective at it, they're interested enough that they'll give you more time either on the spot or later on. And the key point here is that the presentation and the key message that you're conveying doesn't change. It's the same whether you do it in 30 seconds or an hour and a half. The only difference is the amount of detail. But the key message, the key points, always remain the same. And this is really helpful for the next point I'm going to make, which is adapting. This, if it hasn't happened to you already, it will happen. You walk into a you spend weeks preparing for a presentation. You walk into the meeting room, and whoever it is you're presenting to is 20 minutes late because they got caught up in something else. Or another situation is, you've got 20 minutes out of an hour, and there's 2 other presenters, and the first 2 ran long, and you've got 5 minutes to deliver your 20-minute presentation. Happens all the time. it will happen to you. If you know what your key points are, you can adapt to that. You know what to skip over. You know what to focus on. And you can make sure that you hit your 3 to 5 key points and your key message and your key takeaway. And hopefully you put your best foot forward and you've generated enough interest that people are going to give you more time at some later date if they can't do it right now. So I will leave this section on this quote: "A mediocre idea that generates enthusiasm will go further than a great idea that inspires no one." So imagine a great idea that generates enthusiasm, right? That's where we want to be with all this. Understand the value, understand your audience, create energy and enthusiasm, and then make sure that as things change, you can roll with the punches by sort of staying ahead and understanding what the objectives are. So that's it. Connecting with stakeholder value. The connecting brings together, all those aspects, the stakeholder and the value. I'll leave you with a few resources before I open up to questions. And these are some of the things that I referenced in my presentation. The first one is a book called Business Model Generation, which takes you through the whole business model canvas and explains it step by step. There's another version put forth by Ash Moria called the Product Canvas, which I find helpful, especially when I'm working on just a product or a feature. He also has a book called Running Lean, and he also has a really useful website called leansnack.com. The Guide to Presentations, which I referenced in the last section, Mary Munter and Lynn Russell. I definitely recommend that. Very quick and easy read and a good reference material. And then Porter's 5 Forces. Michael Porter was an HBS professor. I don't have a specific book that I would point you to, but there's about 1 million resources on the web to learn more about that. And then lastly, if you'd like to connect, here's my LinkedIn profile. Send me a message and introduce yourself, and I'd be happy to chat further.
Awesome, great talk. Thank you to our speaker, Jonathan Berg, Director of Product Management at Schoology, and really for today's great discussion of selling the project, connecting to value. And as always, for those of you who tuned in, the presentation is going to be posted to our SlideShare channel, so stay tuned for that. And also a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today in the Product Mentor. And don't forget, if you'd like to be a mentor like Jonathan and many of the others that you see along the bottom of your screen, definitely go to theproductmentor.com today and sign up. Our next session starts November 1st. And we need a lot more mentors for a good, successful launch on November 1st. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own, free for everybody, job board at theproductjobs.com. And with that said, I'll see you guys all next time. Bye.